Today, we have the privilege of being joined by Sydney Kamlager. She's Assembly member from California's 54th Assembly District, Austin City Council member Greg Casar, and Tim Black, Operations Director at Cahoots, which is a civilian first responder program in Eugene, Oregon. Today, we'll be discussing a new vision for public safety, non-police emergency first responders. For several weeks now, we've been discussing police violence in America and the killing of Black people by police. Today, we're going to discuss a new vision for first responders and specifically who these first responders are, what type of emergencies would they be responding to, and what are the biggest barriers to making this a reality. Last Friday, the New York Times showcased data from select cities revealing how little of police officers' time is spent responding to violent crime, in some cases as little as 1%. According to the study, police in cities across the country spend about 30 to 40% of their time responding to totally non-criminal calls, whether those are about the unhoused or parking issues. The data showed that about 15 to 20% of time among police departments nationwide are spent on traffic calls. The rest of their time is a mix of low-level misdemeanor property crimes and about 10% on medical calls. One example is over the past month, Denver police responded to 26 calls for service involving people experiencing houselessness on just one block. But across the 10 cities, it was only about 0.5% to 1.8% of their time that police were dealing with what some think police are there to deal with, violent crimes, including assaults, rape, murder, and shootings. And yet, we've expanded police departments so that now there are police in schools, police on public transportation duty, police dealing with complaints that someone is unhoused or that a person is experiencing a mental health crisis, or calls that someone is under the influence. We even send police to address parking problems and neighborhood disputes, like someone using a barbecue in an incorrect manner as occurred in Oakland, or reports of suspicious people, all too often Black people, as occurred in Starbucks in Philadelphia last year. Among the policies gaining traction around the country is community-based emergency first response systems, where trained professionals respond to these calls independent of the criminal legal system. Already, lawmakers in Portland, Denver, and Albuquerque have begun to institute emergency response systems. In Portland, for example, a portion of the $15 million police budget cut funded Portland Street Response, allowing the already existing civilian crisis response team to expand their program. Among our three panelists today, we have Tim Black with us, Operations Director at Cahoots. Cahoots has served as a guide for current efforts to build similar programs. Tim, can you please tell us a little bit about when Cahoots was started and how it's funded?
Absolutely, John, thank you. So Cahoots got its start in 1989 after about 20 years of Whitebird Clinic providing walk-in and phone-based crisis services. The Cahoots program really felt like the next step for us. We had started off trying to find volunteers who could respond for community-based interventions when the need arose, because we recognized that there were folks who just weren't in a position, either because of the crisis that they were in or for other circumstances, they were unable to access those kind of traditional means of crisis response at that time. Additionally, Whitebird Clinic was really looking for a way to provide an alternative to police response for those same types of crises, and a way to really build up our programming in a way that would keep folks out of the jails and out of the hospital system. And it was our approaches to community-based crisis response and the relationship that we had developed with our community at that time that allowed us to really enter into this partnership with the city of Eugene to really build up this program and take what we were doing, integrate it into the public safety system, and really create this third branch of public safety that we now know as behavioral health first response. From our real humble beginnings 31 years ago, we're at a point now where our program is operating on a budget of around $2 million a year. And that comes almost entirely from city budgets with some state grant funding that also supports our operations in a smaller community.
I know you've been getting a lot of calls recently from folks that want to expand and think about how to do this. Can you describe what success you've had and some best practices you've been telling people that want to get these programs started in their own cities?
Yeah, the first thing that we want to know is what else is out there in your community. When we talk about the successes of the Cahoots program and behavioral health first response, like what Cahoots does, those successes are really informed by the other resources that exist in a community to divert folks from the jail, from the ER. You know, what resources do we have to offer beyond a law enforcement response if there is nowhere for anyone else to go? So as we're talking with communities, we really want to learn, what is it that you already have? What's already working? You know, who in your community has the trust of the folks that you want to serve? And do you think that they're in a position to really kind of scale up what they're doing to bring in more of this kind of cahoots type of response into their community?
Building on that, what have you identified as the biggest challenges, both to cahoots and when people are trying to establish these programs in their own cities? And also, and secondly, how can people respond to those challenges?
Yeah. The biggest thing that we're really working to address right now is that point of access. You know, for 31 years, we've utilized the police non-emergency line as the way that people can get a hold of us. And we really took that for granted. And so now as we engage with other communities, you know, we're finding ourselves spending a lot more time talking about what are other ways that this type of program can be integrated into public safety, can still have the same level of diversion from law enforcement, but not have the phone get answered, you know, with your local police department. You know, we recognize now that having that point of connection be law enforcement, even if we're sending out civilians in response, we're still really closing the door to a lot of folks who are disenfranchised at best and more likely oppressed and marginalized by that institution. And so, you know, we're really looking to see, are there ways that we can kind of create a standalone dispatch system for mobile crisis response that's still connected to those other resources, so that we can grab the calls from law enforcement so that police aren't responding to the person on the corner dancing, you know, so that we can handle, you know, calls that are more about harm reduction, you know, than any sort of medical emergency that paramedics might be going out on. And as we move forward, what we really need from other communities that are looking to develop this programming is for them to start to engage in those conversations around, what does accessibility mean? You know, what are the outcomes that they're hoping a program like Cahoots will have in their community, and you know, who needs to be at the table for those discussions in order to make sure that, you know, there's real strong strength in that program as it's implemented.
I think that's really helpful. I'd like to bring in Sydney into this conversation. So Sydney, can you please talk about the work you've been doing with non-law enforcement emergency first response, and some obstacles, you know, you've seen trying to get legislation off the ground?
Sure. Thank you. So earlier this year in January, I authored a bill, AB 2054, the Crisis Act, the Community Response Initiative for Emergency Situations, which essentially would establish a pilot project to scale up community-based organizations to act as first responders. It would be a pilot project in partnership with the Office of Emergency Services through the state. And we would grant out grants, up to 12 grants across the state, to these collectives of community-based organizations who could act as first responders. And the goal for the bill, pre-George Floyd, was to figure out a way to create alternatives for communities who have problems, that want solutions or resolutions to those problems, in a manner that sort of supports de-escalation. We know that all communities, Black, brown, white, Asian, old, young, straight, gender non-conforming, LGBT, all communities have problems. All communities get into crisis. All communities want public safety, but not all communities feel comfortable calling 911, and not all communities feel comfortable having the police in their home. We have to stop assuming that law enforcement, that the first responder that is law enforcement can and is willing to address a level 2 problem with level 2 force. Instead, what we see is that problems get addressed with the same level of force. And so asking law enforcement, who are probably overworked, over-traumatized, and unsympathetic at this point to certain kinds of calls, are using the same kind of adrenaline and the same kind of tactics to deal with an armed robbery as they are dealing with someone who's mentally ill. And it's not safe. for communities. And so AB 2054 looks at a more holistic, hopefully, response and alternative to what we have now.
What has been the reception in Sacramento? You know, when you talk to your colleagues, what are people saying about this bill and, you know, procedurally kind of where it goes next?
So I actually thought this was going to be a sleeper bill in January. I thought, oh, this will be my small but radical approach to how we can impact, the criminal justice world. And this was a bill that didn't actually go through public safety. And I sit on public safety. So it was nice. It was a refresher for me to have this go to another committee. It was met with a lot of positivity. We've had bipartisan response. I think the biggest obstacle is it comes with a huge price tag, about $15 million. The state of California is dealing with a $54 billion deficit. And so not really interested in new programs or projects that are going to cost money. And I think the other obstacle is making sure that the bill is not bastardized or isn't turned into something else to deal with the immediate crisis that we're in as it relates to systemic racism in all forms of the justice world. And so oftentimes there's a knee-jerk reaction. Hey, this is a problem. Here's a solution right here. Let's marry the two and say we fixed it. And this issue is not something that can be fixed with this bill. And so I certainly don't want folks to try to manipulate it into something else.
I mean, what would be something that you would hate to see happen to this particular bill when you talk about it being bastardized?
Well, people like to dump a lot of things into a bill, because it addresses an issue that they have, or it meets the needs of, maybe their special interest groups. And we don't want that. The reality is there are all kinds of emergencies that happen across the state of California, anything from climate and natural disasters to dealing with communities that suffer from mental illness or substance abuse, to domestic violence, to small theft, to intimate partner family issues. And so how do we push or pull together, like I said, collaborative groups of organizations that have the credibility, that are trusted by the communities to step in as first responders, noticing that first responders are not always just law enforcement. Sometimes it can be DCFS. Sometimes it can also be, your firefighters. But how can we triage this? Not using the police as the portal. Because what we also know is that people want to have solutions to their problems, but they don't necessarily want to be funneled through the justice system. And once the police are called, you are more than likely, there will be a report, something may be filed, someone may be arrested, someone will be charged, and then you will end up in the court system. You may end up through probation, you may end up through parole, you may end up dealing with a jail or a prison or a judge. And so how can you solve problems without going through that system? Because once you're in it, you never get out of it. And folks don't always want that to be the solution.
Absolutely. I mean, you hear advocates talking not only about policing now, but mass incarceration and all the impact. So I appreciate you saying that. Greg, I'd love to bring you into this conversation. Can you, tell our viewers what you've been working on in Austin?
In Austin, we've, participated in the same movement over the years. When I first came on to city council 5.5 years ago, I was the first ever person elected to represent my district. It's the lowest income part of the city, the most immigrant part of the city, where we had neighborhoods with no park. We came onto council, and the elementary school just wanted money to make sure they didn't have to lay off social workers and how to replace the copper wiring and the lights outside. And in a city as prosperous as ours, a lot of times it just didn't make any sense how we couldn't address some of those basic needs. And everybody could point the finger at the federal government and the state government, and those places are in many ways to blame, but also our own budget. So much of the city's prosperity and public dollars were sucked up into one place, the police budget. And so we have communities asking for so many different kinds of investment, but the primary investment we're making was in policing as a response to those problems. And so over the years, we tried to sort of chip away slowly at it, saying, okay, we'll still hire more cops, but I'd make a motion to say, let's try to reduce that by a few, or 1 year, maybe let's not hire any and invest in other things. But it still hasn't made the change and the difference that we need. So this year, I think, the movement is born out of a lot of hurts, but also there's a lot of energy and power there. The council just unanimously said that as we head into the budget, let's reduce our police force by at least 100 positions. And so that's the starting point. Is it going to be 100, or is it going to be 200, or is there going to be more, so that we can actually more fully invest in alternatives instead of just chipping away at the edges? So, we've started to create a program that's in line with what is being done in Eugene by Cahoots and others, but it's just not quite to scale. And I think this is a real moment where city leaders can be pushed to do way more than we've ever done before, to actually bring to communities like my district that need public investment, a different kind of investment to deal with their challenges.
How are other city leaders responding in this moment in Austin? So are they pushing, or is it, you're in your district, you're pushing, and they're thinking about it?
Well, no, I mean, I'll tell you, for the last couple of budgets, right, I've made motions to cut the police budget by a small amount, and usually not even been close to having a majority. This year, we had a unanimous city council talking about starting out at least 100 police positions reduced. So there's a real shift there. There's real momentum, and I think that we need to continue to point to each city that's doing the best thing to push the next city to go even further, and to sort of show and develop these models of alternative community response. I think right now is the moment to do it, because we've been told for so long that mass incarceration or mass policing and surveillance are to protect us. And in this moment, we're seeing how it actually hurts our community. Same thing with rubber bullets and tear gas and all these things that were invested in by cities supposedly as a mode of protection. Right now, I think there's just so much clarity that these things actually hurt us, that we have to act probably in way more significant ways than most city administrators or mayors or budget leaders are ready to do. But if we don't do it now, then I think it's just going to take so long to unwind years of bad budgets.
Thank you. Are there any obstacles you foresee, in the coming months, and how do you plan to respond?
I think that that's part of why I think these calls are really important, because one of the challenges we have as local governments is how to successfully replace the public investment in policing with that alternative response, right? We've seen those alternative responses at the grassroots level, where families or communities and mutual aid organizations come together. But at scale, local governments have focused on policing for so long that it takes some time and some trust to come up with something that's a real intervention that works as a replacement. And so, for example, in Austin, we decriminalized just being a person that is experiencing homelessness. My city, like so many others, had a progressive brand, but was doing horrible things. And one of those things was saying that homelessness is a crime. And so the idea was to start addressing homelessness with housing instead of with policing. But actually bringing together the social work and the care and the housing and the resources necessary to replace policing, it's easy to talk about, but actually really committing ourselves to doing it and taking the time and building the public support as we make that transition is a real challenge, but it's what we have to do. And so that's why it's great that we have these models in different cities that we can, start replacing how we treat addiction, start replacing how we address mental health. And I think that's the next challenge.
So thank you, first of all. There's a lot of organizers, people in the streets every day, in Austin, in LA, in Eugene. There's folks that are already doing the work. For the people that aren't doing the work yet, the casual viewer who's busy and wants to plug in but hasn't quite done so yet, how can we help them, right? So how can they help you, first of all, push these policies through? And is there any messaging that you'd like to kind of emphasize in trying to persuade folks that this needs to be done immediately? And we can start with you, Tim. We'll mix it up.
Yeah. So first and foremost, when we're engaging with folks in our own community, one of the things we're encouraging them to do is go out and talk to your neighbors. Respect social distancing, wear the mask, but when we have those relationships with our neighbors, we're much more likely to reach out to them directly when there's an issue instead of, calling the police to come in. So there are things that folks can do right now without changes to legislation that can reduce the potential for there to be police involvement in disagreements and conflicts that are happening in their own, immediate neighborhoods. Kind of looking at other things that we need to really support this initiative, to support this movement, and to support this legislation, is to be willing to engage in hard conversations. Show up to city council. Sign up to speak about your experiences. You don't have to agree with me for me to want you to have your voice heard, in those city budget council discussions. Really, it's just about getting out there, learning more, being willing to make yourself uncomfortable, and then finding ways to plug in and serve.
Thanks, Tim. Sydney?
So, I think it's really important to read and to learn more about what is already out there, like the Cahoots program, like AB 2054, to attend meetings like city council meetings, to be able to track what your local elected officials like Greg have been doing when they're talking about what to do with funding, except for hiring more police. But and it's also really important to have thoughtful and honest discussions about what communities want and how effective these new alternatives and proposals can be. Because people get very afraid when they hear you say, we want to replace X with Y. And they want to know, does Y come with authority? Will Y keep me out of maybe the juvenile or the adult system? Will Y be effective and create resolution? Because you really don't want to just have repeat calls to an entity or a group that continues to come out and doesn't actually help the person through the crisis. And people have to be honest about what constitutes a crisis for them. And people have to be honest about, why police are here. Police are here to protect, but they're here to protect A against B. They're here to protect property, over people. And so what we're seeing in the streets have been the exhaustion of feeling like I don't exist or I'm not of value. And then that's why I can either be treated this way, or this is why I'm just arbitrarily arrested and booked, or assumed to be on probation when you're actually coming, to deal with a call about, someone with a substance abuse issue or a little one who's out in the middle of the street and they shouldn't be out in the middle of the street. So if you don't value me as a person, then you're more likely than not to make different assumptions about who I am and then throw me into this penal system. And so we have to have, honest discussions about that, because ultimately that disproportionately impacts certain groups over others. And I think what we're seeing now in the streets is a number of folks, non-Black folks, realizing that their protection has been at the expense of other people. Their fears have been at the expense of other people. And how do we move through that space to get to a space where everyone can feel like they can call the same number or call on the same group and get the same kind of equal, just, compassionate response?
Absolutely. And I'm encouraged that more of those discussions are happening every day, and encouraged by all the work you all are doing. Greg, how do you feel about this moment?
Well, I think as far as to your question of how should people help, I think that everybody has their network. And so I really expect, and we're already starting to see in places, especially in places like Minneapolis, misinformation and deliberate fear mongering against this movement and against this moment. And so every single person watching this that has just even listened through this set of speakers already has the power and ability in their family network, on your neighborhood listserv, just when you're out on a walk and somebody asks you about it, to be able to dispel the misinformation that we know there's going to be a lot of money behind that disinformation, because this movement is something born out of actually wanting people to be safer. And I've seen so often whenever we try to, have some level of progressive transformation on these issues, people, opposition so often goes to making people scared, as if the intention is to make people less safe, when the opposite is true. So really helping on that front is really important.
Thank you for mentioning that opposition. Before we close, and you already mentioned it, Greg, but how have each of you, Tim and Sydney, responded to pushback? Because we're going to all, sorry, I shouldn't include myself, but community advocates are going to all get opposition. We know that. So any strategies or messaging for responding to that you've already encountered, I'm sure. We can start with, go ahead.
Yeah, the biggest thing that we've seen pushback in our own community, with some of the local initiatives is, well, where is that money going to go if it's not going to law enforcement? And our response is, what we see on Cahoots is crisis is informed by an inability to meet basic needs, inability to access resources. And so when we're looking at how a community could use public safety dollars for true safety of the public, we need to be looking at things like basic needs, mental health services, better substance abuse treatment, low barrier shelters. And when we talk to these folks that really just don't want to see any of that money get cut from that police budget, then what is the alternative? How else are we going to be able to meet those needs? Because we're both driving down the same street. We're seeing the same tents. We're seeing the same people who are forced, to live outside just because there aren't the resources in our community to respond to them on a basic human level.
Good. Thank you. Go ahead, Sydney.
So I think our biggest obstacle right now is our state deficit. And so, I would implore folks to call members of the state Senate here in California, both local government and in appropriations, to really encourage them to pass this bill and move it along so that it can end up at the governor's desk. This money, actually, how this would be funded, AB 2054, would come from the general fund. So it wouldn't be taking dollars from local governments that employ law enforcement or police departments. But I think part of that conversation that folks can be having is, numbers of overtime, workers' compensation, liability and lawsuits. How high are those numbers on the line items for the local governments that have, these different first responder entities? And can those numbers be drawn down if, in fact, folks are implementing other kinds of initiatives or programs or alternatives to how those folks are going out to respond? So hopefully you would see that those numbers would decrease. You would have fewer, overtime hours, you'd have fewer workers' compensation claims, and possibly fewer lawsuits, because you're using people's taxpayers' dollars, more effectively to handle the myriad of crises that happen in different communities.
Definitely. And yeah, I think it's important to remember we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and there's a lot of crises happening in our communities. So I appreciate that. I plan to call my lawmakers. I'm Californian, so I'll make some calls this week. And I appreciate you all. Thanks so much. Please stay on, because I want to ask you some more questions. But for our viewers out there, join us tomorrow. We have a Wayne County prosecutor candidate forum at 1 p.m. Eastern. And again, I thank you all so much. Appreciate your time.